Hello and welcome to this lecture on protests in China, which is part of the ReConnect MOOC Introduction to Chinese Politics and Society. My name is Christian Goebel. I'm a professor of modern China studies at the University of Vienna. So if I asked you to name protest events in China, most of you would come up with maybe 2 or 3 or 4 events like the Tiananmen Square uprising in 1989, the White Paper protests in November 2022, maybe the Xiamen anti-PX protests in 2007, or the Nanjing student protests in 2021. But protests take place in China literally every day, and often there are dozens and sometimes more than 100 protests on a single day. Of course, these protests are quite different from the ones that we saw in 1989 or in 2022, which challenged the government. But still, it is remarkable that so many protests can take place in such a restrictive setting like we have in China. So in this lecture, I would like to tell you more about the kind of events these protests represent and why they are tolerated. I will cover a lot of ground in this lecture. You will learn about some cultural aspects of protests in China. I will explain a little bit about how we use social media to collect data on protest, how we study protest. You will learn about the reasons why citizens take to the streets, how they do so, how they express their grievances, what role social media plays in their protests, and I will also talk about consequences. So what consequences can protesters face and what factors determine how severe these consequences are. And I will end with a conclusion and an outlook that reflects on the data we collected and the kind of research we should be doing in the future. I headlined this slide a protest culture because protests have, just like petitions, a very long history in China. They are less a means to try and overthrow the government. Of course, these attempts have taken place in China several times, but everyday protests are more an instrument of participation. They are an attempt by citizens to draw the attention of higher level governments to their grievances and either persuade them or leverage them to intervene on their behalf. Protests, unless they're registered, which is very difficult, are illegal, but they're often tolerated. The protesters usually don't refer to themselves and their activities as protesters, but they talk about the defense of rights, 维权. So this goes back to the idea that not only the citizens have responsibilities, but the rulers have responsibilities as well. It goes back to Confucius. And if the rulers don't do their job well, the citizens have the right to resist. Frequently, these everyday protests are about material grievances. For example, laborers who don't receive wages from their employers, or homeowners who don't get what they ordered from real estate developers, and not so often about ideal issues like democracy or human rights. Protesters also don't oppose the government usually, but they appeal to the central government or to higher level government to intervene on their behalf. Frequently, protests are organized, and we see that by identical t-shirts or slogans or prepared banners they're bringing to a protest, but the protesters often deny organization because organizing a protest is a serious charge in China and can get you in serious trouble. So of course protesters say, no, we haven't organized, we just came here together spontaneously. Before I tell you more about the nature of protests in China, I would like to tell you a little bit about how we get to this data, what the sources are for the results that I will present in a minute. Now, we use social media to study protest and really draw upon a groundbreaking project called the Wikidonor blog There's a hyperlink in the document which I highly recommend you to check out. It's a collection of nearly 75,000 protest events that took place in China between June 2013 and June 2016, collected by 2 citizen journalists who were arrested in 2016, and the project stopped then. We tried to continue their work by searching for protest events in social media and using keywords that we think they used. And then, of course, because the keywords will reveal a lot of posts that are not related to protests, classify these posts to determine the likelihood that they describe a protest. And we did that by using artificial neural networks, one to classify text and the other one to classify images. What are the reasons that compel Chinese citizens to take to the streets, although it is so risky? Here you see an analysis of the Wikidonna data that I introduced earlier, and it shows you that there are basically 2 main protest issues, one titled labor here and the other real estate. Labor protests, in most cases, are related to migrant workers who do not get their full wages and then demonstrate in front of the factory building, in most cases before Chinese New Year, so they can pressure their employers to pay them the full wages before they go home and see their family. Real estate related protests are a little bit more complex. There are 2 kinds of these protests. One is that a developer, for example, goes bankrupt or for other reasons does not deliver the apartment that was contracted to the buyers. That means very often the buyers gave a prepayment, but the developer goes bankrupt and cannot deliver the apartment, so the buyers take to the streets. Another type of protest is when they already received the apartment, but the apartment or the environment does not match the specifications in the contract. So, for example, the developers might, where they promised a park, build a parking lot, or they promised that near the apartment there is a subway station, or that a subway station will be built, but they lied. There is no subway station. Or they say that there is a really good and well-known school in the district, which is then also not the case, and that understandably makes homeowners very angry. There are also things that sound more funny, like there is one instance where the buyers were promised a pond in the apartment complex, and the developers simply put some blue foil on the ground and some little bridges on top of it and said, here is your pond, and the buyers were not amused. Other reasons for protests take place, for example, in the countryside, where land is taken from farmers, appropriated by officials for development, so to build residential areas or residential apartments on them, or to build, for example, electric converters or garbage incinerators on such land. And this also enrages the local populace. The same is the case with evictions, where people who live in an apartment are forced to move out because a neighborhood is being redeveloped. A lot of other issues, for example, fraud in P2P schemes, taxi strikes, shopkeepers who take to the streets because their licenses are running out. There is a category medical mistreatment where people take to the streets because they lost a loved one, or very often they don't take to the streets but to the hospital, where they stage demonstrations like burning paper money inside the hospital, or bringing a coffin to the hospital, sometimes even bringing a dead child to the hospital to protest against medical mistreatment. And in some cases, they want justice, they want the doctors to be punished. In other cases, they want compensation for the loss of life. And there is, of course, environmental protests, but they're not as frequent as you might think, listening to the news. And very often the environmental protests are also the kind that we term not in my backyard protests. So, for example, protests against garbage incinerators. So not protests for the common good of clean air all over China, but locally confined because citizens don't want a factory or a garbage incinerator built in their neighborhood. Here's a graph that shows the development of protest issues over time. This graph was created using our own data, so this does not come from the Wikidata dataset. There are two remarkable trends in this graph. The first is the decline in the number of events that we were able to collect. Now, we don't know where this decline comes from. Of course, it's possible that there are less grievances than before, the government is doing a good job, and people don't need to protest as much anymore. But if we look at other data, like, for example, complaints to government websites, which are increasing or have increased, we doubt that this is a valid explanation. Another explanation, a second explanation, might be the increasing efficiency of surveillance and repression, which might dissuade protesters from taking to the streets. And I think this might be a valid explanation. A third explanation is that people protest as much or even more as before, but due to censorship and protesters using different platforms, we are not able to collect all these events, which is also a valid explanation. The second striking trend is that in terms of relative importance, real estate has overtaken labor. So this, I think, can be explained by the fact that the real estate sector has faced difficulties, increasing difficulties in the last decades, and this is reflected in this data. So liquidity problems, even by great developers like Evergrande, for example, lead to problems in the delivery of apartments and houses, which makes people more liable to take to the streets and protest and help that they will be compensated for their losses. What does an ordinary protest look like? Most protests in China are small, so 5 to 10 persons, sometimes 20 persons. They're peaceful, so they're holding up banners, maybe shouting slogans, and they're stationary. So they might stand in front of a factory building, inside an apartment compound, or in front of a government building, trying not to disrupt traffic and trying to not disturb others too much. They would bear printed or handwritten banners very often. Sometimes they would wear T-shirts printed with protest slogans, matching vests or hats, sometimes with Chinese characters on them. For example, saying injustice or return our hard-earned money to us. Occasionally, protests are different. There might be strikes or riots, or especially workers threatening to jump from buildings or going up in cranes, holding up a sign and threatening to jump from the crane they are occupying. But again, the majority of protests is small and peaceful and confined to one locality. Protest scholars often talk about protest intensity and its impact on protest outcomes. And there is a Chinese saying that captures the essence of this in the Chinese context very well. You see it here on the right-hand side in Chinese characters, when it says in Chinese, 大闹大解决，小闹小解决，不闹不解决, which means, in a very colloquial way, translated by me, if you make a big stink, there will be a big solution. If you make a small stink, there will be a small solution. If you don't make a fuss at all, there will be no solution. So that means if you manage to mobilize a lot of people to take to the streets and perhaps be a little bit disruptive, then the chances that you will receive concessions are high. But of course, when you do this, the chances that you get in trouble are also very high. This is one point. Another point is that trying to get somebody to join a protest for a grievance that only concerns a small amount of people is not so easy. So if I don't get my wages paid, why should somebody else join in my protests? So the protests in China, as you've learned, are not about common goods that benefit many, like democracy, human rights, clean air, women's rights, equality, and so on, but private goods that are more difficult to mobilize around. And the solution that Chinese protesters devised is to use social media, but not to use social media to organize or to mobilize people to take place in a street protest, because this would also get them into trouble, but to take photos, stage photos really, in a physical protest, lining up for a nice picture where you can read all the slogans, where you can see the government building and so on, and putting these on social media and then asking followers to repost this content in the hope that it gets viral, that a lot of attention is devoted to this issue, and that then government officials will learn about this issue and intervene, or will be forced to intervene because there is so much public attention in this particular protest. I can tell you from the data that we have that sometimes it works, but very often it doesn't work, simply because those who engage in these tactics do not have very many followers in the social networks they are using, which means that their complaints are often not even seen. In the course of this lecture so far, I talked about risks and repressions a lot, but I haven't explained yet what can happen to you if you engage in a protest in China. And here are some possible consequences. In the data set we have, we found evidence of repression only in about 25% of all cases. So it is possible that in the majority of cases, nothing happens. So you protest and hold up your signs and you go home again and nothing happens to you. Although I have to mention that usually police comes to the protests, they film the protests, and I am pretty sure that the faces of those who take part in a protest will be saved in a database with a note that they have taken part in a protest. But sometimes in these 25% of the cases where we can determine repression, we learn from the social media writings from the protesters that they were beaten by thugs, by hired hands, hired security forces, or the police. Sometimes they also talk about being arrested and then maybe released very quickly afterwards. It's also possible that they get an administrative fine for example, disturbing public order, or also quite frequent for those who face consequences is administrative detention for 3, 4, 5 days, up to 15 days. But if conditions are serious, a prison sentence might be in order. This can be several months, it can be a year, but it can also be several years, depending on, well, what kind of event the protesters engaged in. There are quite a few factors that determine the severity of consequences. Is a protest against the system? Very severe consequences, or related to material grievances like most protests in China? Is it against local administration or enterprise? Is it a mass protest or only a small gathering? Is it a violent or a peaceful protest? Is it located in the city where a lot of people can look on and escalation is more likely? Or in the countryside, is it in the Han Chinese heartland or in the minority regions where protests are often connected with identity and that's what the government fears, separatism. So these protests are cracked down upon harder. Are they endangering public order? And also the question, who pays for the compensation if the protesters get what they want, the government or someone else? So if the protest is against land grabs, the government profits from these land grabs, then repression is more likely. But if it is against a factory, labor issues, for example, the factory has to foot the bill, so repression ordered by the government is less likely. What I hope you've taken away from this lecture is that protests are an everyday phenomenon in China. Most protests are small, peaceful, and appeal to the government instead of opposing it. But of course, there are events where protesters do oppose the government, although they're not very frequent. And of course, there is always a risk that peaceful material protests spiral out into protests that are more challenging to the government and that might end up opposing the government. Protesters, as in other countries, integrate social media into their repertoires of contention, though how they do so is quite different than, for example, the Arab Spring, where protesters use social media to mobilize people to take part in a physical protest, whereas in China, they try to mobilize people to take part in an online protest related to a physical protest. There is, as you probably know, an increasing surveillance and repressive capacity of the Chinese government, which certainly has an impact on protests, and we are conducting research to find out how exactly this impact, or what exactly this impact looks like. We've also seen from the data we collected a declining rate of observed protests, where we still need to find out if this is because of a more responsive government, if it is because of increased surveillance and targeted repression, or because of a higher censorship of social media, which prevents us from accessing such content. Before I finish this lecture, a few points to contextualize what I just said. We looked at a large amount of cases and established trends. That means the findings are probabilistic and not deterministic. So if you protest in a non-obtrusive way against a non-political issue, you're probably fine, but it's not guaranteed. There is always a risk of severe punishment if you are in the wrong place at the wrong time, or if your actions are interpreted as challenging the system, you are in trouble, in deep trouble. This can be seen, for example, in the harsh repression of political protests like the 1989 protests that I already mentioned. Some of the protesters who were prominent, those who could not flee to other countries or were allowed to travel to other countries, have been imprisoned for a very long time, potentially even decades. And the conditions in Chinese prisons are not something that you want to experience. We've also seen retributions, harsh retributions against the white paper protesters in November 2022. Also, one very important point to mention, not everywhere is the same in China. There is considerably more risk of protesting in minority regions like Xinjiang or Tibet, especially if you are a minority and especially if you take to the streets because you want more rights for your ethnic group. With this, I thank you. I hope you've taken away something and enjoy the rest of your day.